Unfortunately for businesses today, ransomware, fraud, and other cybersecurity threats have become far too common. With cybercrime expected to exceed $6 trillion in 2021, these threats are only becoming greater and more difficult to prevent. Businesses of all sizes have become top targets for cybercriminals due to fundamental control gaps and their willingness to pay ransom to restore operations. Even when basic controls are in place, cybercriminals are still finding ways to exploit weaknesses and extort large sums of money. So, the question remains, how can you protect your business and customers from falling victim to these attacks? The first step is understanding what you are up against. Thank you for joining us for a free webinar on how you can protect your business from ransomware and other cybersecurity threats. During this discussion, we'll explore the current threat landscape in 2021, how to determine your current security posture, and additional ways you can defend your business. Welcome to Don't Be the Next Target, Defending Against Ransomware and Other Cybersecurity Threats, presented by GraVoc.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Don't Be the Next Target, Defending Against Ransomware and Other Cybersecurity Threats. My name is Nate Gravel. I am the Vice President of Information Security and IT here at GraVoc. Before we jump into today's agenda, I'm just going to go through a few slides on who we are and what we do, just to give you a little bit of context about the company and our services specific to information security. So in terms of our company profile, on the next slide here, we've been in business for 27, going on 28 years. We have roughly 60 employees in 4 integrated practices. We are a family-owned and operated consulting firm here in Peabody, Mass. In terms of the practices themselves, we've got a little more detail on the next slide here. I obviously represent our information security practice. We also have a software solutions practice, an information technology practice, and a creative technology practice. So the idea of our company, as we've built it, is to be kind of a one-to-many solution for small and mid-sized businesses in the technology space. On the next slide here, I have a little bit more detail on kind of our service areas and information security. So we kind of focus in 3 concentrations, if you will, inside of the information security space. The first is our risk management and compliance, or our GRC services. So that's anything from advisory, virtual CISO, ISO type work, down through policy and procedure development, governance, risk assessment, security awareness training, things like that. The next category or bucket of services that we provide is IT assurance, which is your ethical hacking, penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, red teaming, web, mobile, wireless security assessments, cloud configuration reviews, things of that nature. And finally, we also do IT audits. So that could be IT general controls audits, compliance gap analysis, things of that nature. On the next slide here, we'll jump into today's agenda. So we're going to start with a video. It's one that I like to use. I've been using it for a couple years now, but it's still very relevant in terms of breaking down the anatomy of a ransomware attack and just showing how anybody can be a target. It's not necessarily, just huge corporations that are being targeted by ransomware attacks these days. In fact, it might be more so swinging in the other direction, as we'll get into later in the presentation. So after the video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the cybercrime landscape and what's driving all this cybersecurity related activity that you see out in the wild, so to speak. And then we'll go into some of the common threats and mitigation. So we'll focus on the top 3 threats. And this is according to Verizon's data breach investigation report for 2021. So every year, Verizon studies different breaches, different incidents that have been reported. And then they put together kind of, a report on the trends amongst those breaches and incidents. And for the last couple years now, the top threats, particularly in the SMB space, have been phishing, malware, ransomware, and credential theft and account takeover. So those are really where we're going to focus the conversation today. Obviously spend a bit of time on ransomware as advertised, but talk about the others in conjunction with that, because really these techniques are often used together to create a breach or a compromise and reach that end goal of exploiting a company, which is being done, almost daily from our perspective in terms of the amount of activity we're seeing out there. In terms of mitigation measures, we'll get into some of the countermeasures that your business can put in place to, if not prevent some of these threats, at least detect and respond to them in an effective way. We will have a question and answer period toward the end of the presentation. So if you want to drop any of your questions into the chat, we will get to those. I don't have a live stream kind of feeding those to me in real time. So just know that I will get back to those at the end of the presentation, and then we'll wrap up with some closing remarks. So without further ado, we'll jump into the video on the anatomy of a ransomware attack.
How did you decide to become a hacker?
Well, I'm not really sure what it means to become a hacker. That's like some guy in a hoodie who types really fast and stays up all night writing code and cracking passwords. It's not me. I just spy on people and see what makes them click. It's not a bad job.
Mark Hanning, CEO of Qualicart, set to report earnings after their blockbuster IPO.
So you consider this a job?
I put a lot of work into this. I'm not lazy. It takes research to figure out the key players, learn all about them, their families, their friends, what they care about. You have to understand the company's organization. I get a lot of my information from the sales department because they're always so quick and eager. They're hungry. People trust too easily. They don't look at the details. I do. Details matter. That's what I'm good at. It has to look completely believable. It has to look familiar. This is where research is important. It's not some generic piece of spam. It's an email from their boss with their company's signature. It's written in the voice of the boss. It's what he would say if he were writing this.
What about the malware itself? How does that work?
Somebody else out there already wrote all the code that does the actual attack. I'm just using it in the attachment. My skill is in my ability to get a bunch of people to click on that attachment. I always wonder what it's like when the whole thing unfolds on their end, when the panic sets in.
Please leave your message after the beep.
Hey, this is Rajiv in finance. Call me as soon as you get this. Something's up with my laptop. I can't.
Katie, are you on your way into the office? Something's going on with our file servers.
Karen in HR, our benefits dashboard seems really slow. We're getting calls from users on it. Give me a call when you get this. Joining conference now.
Apparently, there's a malware attack targeting our main...
It's ransomware. They're holding us hostage.
We're locked out of everything. I can't even check my phone. What about the backup?
That will take days.
We need this fixed now. Pay it. We don't have a choice. We're reporting earnings in 2 hours.
But how do we know that they'll...
Pay it. Put every single person on getting us back up and running. That's the only priority now.
Okay, it's done.
I have the decrypt key. Mark, we have a big problem. The ransomware was just to distract us. They got inside. They got everything. Customer data, financials, everything.
Qualicart is reeling today from the news that hackers have released the personal information of nearly
The
2
Nasdaq
million
closed
customers.
lower today, led by Qualicart, which was down 14% on news that their recent data breach may be far worse than the company
Its stock
originally
fell to a
acknowledged.
new all-time low on news that CEO Mark Hanning is stepping down after what is turning out to be one of the worst breaches of personal information in recent history.
Do you feel bad about releasing the personal information? All the financials? All the money that was lost?
All I did was get the files. I'm not the one that decided to release them. I'm not the one that shorted the stock. Somebody else had their reasons for that. It's above my pay grade. I was paid to do a job, and I did it well. And that's what's expected of anyone, isn't it? Anyway, markets bounce back.
So a lot to unpack in that video. I mean, I guess the underlying sentiment that we're seeing here is that ransomware and cybercrime in particular is a very much an organized event. You know, the hacker in the video wasn't really a hacker much beyond sending some phishing emails that, you know, she scraped off of social media. There were other people involved in terms of creating ransomware and you know, creating the effects that would have on the network when that all unpacked. And then, you know, obviously they were stealing data and there was data exfiltration. So that's really what we're dealing with today's cybercrime landscape is a very organized type of crime. So much so that it has, you know, figures exceeding $6 trillion in terms of projected costs by the end of this year. So you can see how good they've become at, you know, exploiting, you know, not just large companies that have stock prices that you can short, but, you know, all sorts of size companies. Really, hackers take the path of least resistance. So essentially, if they see something that they can exploit, they will. So that is why, you know, every company, small or large, has to be worried about kind of, you know, cybersecurity as a whole and what they're doing to protect themselves. So just to kind of give you a flavor for what we're up against, if we move to the next slide here. We'll see kind of, this is the internet broken down in the whole, you know, iceberg analogy. When, you know, you see 10% of the iceberg, 90% of it is beneath the surface. Same concept here in terms of the surface web, deep web, and dark web. So what we use in our day-to-day lives is basically the surface web. That's what you can reach via Google search. It only represents about 40% of the infrastructure, or 4% rather, of the infrastructure on the internet. The other 96% is considered the deep or dark web. Deep web is really kind of the initial purpose of the internet for research and, you know, government use and things of that nature, more like peer-to-peer networks. And then the dark web is, you know, obviously what we hear about mostly in the news of where, you know, confidential information is being bought and sold, you know, credentials, financial information. You have to have a special browser to access that area of the web. And there's all sorts of nefarious things that go on in that segment of the web. On the next slide here, we can see, I won't go through all of them, but we can see an illustration of kind of the values associated with, you know, different components that, you know, that can be bought and sold on the dark web. As I said, most organizations are seeing some level of this activity. It's not one person, you know, sitting in their basement hacking away. There are cybercrime syndicates groups that specialize in certain areas of cybercrime activity. So they, you know, create botnets and then lease them to spammers by the hour, much like you could, you know, rent infrastructure from Azure or Amazon or GCP. You know, there's obviously groups that specialize in malware and getting access to infrastructure, you know, just doing financial transactions as money mules. So there are a lot of different specializations out there, and they work together to kind of, you know, each get their payday, if you will. So on the next slide here, you'll see a little bit more about kind of the values associated with, you know, different account types if one of those account types gets compromised and then resold on the dark web, that's about the per account value that they go for on the right hand side. Those are changing all the time. It's a sliding scale, like any economy, supply and demand. Those values will go up or down. But generally speaking, if you look at across all the accounts that you might have, on the internet, if they were compromised and tallied up, the reason we put $1,200 is all you're worth on the dark web is, that's kind of the figure that those accounts would add up to for, the average individual. So on the next slide here, we'll see what an e-commerce site looks like on the dark web. So these are different credit card BIN numbers that have been compromised. You can see who the card carrier is or the card provider, whether it's a debit or credit card, and then the different aspects of the data of the bank that's associated with and all that good stuff. You'll see the price for those. You can literally just add those to your cart like you would anything on Amazon. Go to the checkout and pay for them, usually obviously in cryptocurrency or something of that nature, so that the transaction is relatively anonymous. So it's not difficult to get into cybercrime. You do not have to have an advanced degree in hacking technology, reverse engineering of malware or anything like that. It is very much a cottage industry of, if you have some resources and are resourceful enough and can make connections, then you can participate in trying to make financial gain for yourself or whatever motives you might have. So that's kind of the cybercrime landscape in a nutshell. I mean, we could do a whole presentation on that, but we'll move into kind of some of the top threats that we're seeing amongst our clients, but also as validated by the most recent data breach investigation report by Verizon. So on the next slide here, we'll see kind of the common threats. So again, citing this same report, it's actually last year's report, 2020, but 2021 was about the same. 90% of all breaches examined by Verizon's data breach investigation report had some component of social engineering. As we saw in the video, obviously phishing is the easiest for attackers to enact because it's as easy as clicking on opening an email and subscribing to a botnet of some or distribution list of some sort that you get of compromised email addresses or email addresses that are legitimate to individuals and sending out spam type emails. It could be more targeted, like the spear phishing example that we saw in the video, but again, that's a pretty easy avenue of attack for attackers, which is why it's so common. So on the next slide here, we'll talk about just a recap of the common threats to businesses. That should be 2021. Again, the results haven't changed from 2020 to 2021. The reports were, while they contain different data, basically underlined and highlighted the same trends, which is essentially phishing, malware, ransomware, credential theft, and account takeover were the top 3 threats facing small and mid-sized businesses, but businesses of any size really. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about phishing. Fun fact about phishing. The Nigerian prince email scams last year, and I don't know what the stat is for this year, but they still had roughly a 1% success rate. So we all laugh about getting an email from a Nigerian prince because it's been literally since the dawn of the internet and email, it's been kind of the textbook phishing scheme. But amazingly, it still works 1% of the time, which is pretty significant, and especially when you consider the dollar amount that it roughly led to in lost and stolen funds. So pretty amazing that in 2020, 2021, we're still dealing with that, but it just goes to show that it's a volume play for phishing. The more that they send, the higher chance they have at being successful. And all you really need is one person to fall for it and to take the bait to carry out your attack. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about phishing, especially over the past year or so. Obviously, in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, what we show on screen here was Q1 2020, so kind of right as shelter in place was happening in March, and some of the news was coming out about the pandemic. You can see the spike in coronavirus domains that were registered. So those are landing pages for all the phishing emails that were going out. And the attacks themselves were up about 600% in that time period. Now, obviously that's tailed off as we're 18 months into the pandemic, but it just goes to show that the attackers will follow a trend and exploit people's fear, uncertainty, and doubt when they can. And coronavirus was certainly the way to do so last year, and is still relevant obviously today as we're starting to see various waves of the virus and its effects. So on the next slide here, we'll show some of the news headlines related to kind of things that were kind of tangents or running in parallel to coronavirus. Different unemployment programs and various loan programs and things like that were put out to help people deal with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. The attackers obviously took advantage of those channels as well and tried to hijack or put themselves in the middle of those transactions. On the next slide, we'll see some of the similar to phishing via email. We saw an uptick related to again, COVID-19 in what's called smishing or SMS phishing, if you will, basically phishing through text message. So these are just examples that we pulled of the different types of things that attackers were trying to do to get people to click on something. And obviously mobile devices aren't safe from any of this activity either. So on the next slide, we'll kind of run into malware, ransomware. Obviously, we went over some of that in the attack, anatomy of attack video. But roughly 67% of malware victims last year were small to mid-sized businesses with 1,000 employees or less. So as you can see, it's not just major companies that are being targeted. It's companies like ours or a company like yours that attackers are going after because they can ask for any ransom that they want. I think ransomware has been interesting in the fact that it's shown everybody that they don't have to be a financial institution or a healthcare provider or somebody that's heavily regulated because of the nature of the information that they have, for that information to be important to that company. So every company has data that's important to them, and when they can't use it, or infrastructure that's important to them, and when they can't use it, they'd be willing to pay a ransom to get it back. And that's the trend we've been seeing over time. Is they're not attacking heavily regulated industry only. It's anybody that has any sort of infrastructure or data that would be hard pressed if they couldn't use it. So there's an estimated 350,000 new malware variants identified every day. So you can imagine that no antivirus product is going to be able to keep up with that sheer volume of productivity. So we'll get into, when we get into the mitigation measures, we'll talk about defense in depth, which is basically having a layered security approach to protecting your business. So on the next slide here, we'll just see some stats from this first one's from Carbon Black. A lot of what's driving the ransomware malware activity is that you can make a lot more money, especially in other countries, including the US, as a ransomware developer than you can as a regular software developer. So this chart just kind of illustrates what the yield is on somebody's efforts, either as a legitimate software developer versus the last bar being a ransomware developer on average. So you can see the incentive there for somebody to go rogue, if you will, when there's that much money involved, or that much more money involved than through legitimate means. On the next slide, I'm just showing kind of some of the supply chain attacks that we've seen. So, one of the things that came out towards the end of last year was the SolarWinds attack that obviously affected the White House and the DOJ and a bunch of government organizations. And the way that was affected wasn't a direct attack on those organizations themselves, but malware being placed downstream at a vendor, in this case SolarWinds. So they infected the update server for the SolarWinds Orion platform, and basically piggybacked off of what looked to be a security patch or update to deliver their malware. So, I guess I'm highlighting this because it's another level of sophistication that we now have to deal with in terms of these attacks being carried out. There's many more examples of supply chain attacks since SolarWinds, but this one was obviously one that kind of shook us as a nation because of its how wide its impact was on the country as a whole. On the next slide, I'll show you kind of a ransomware as a service model. So as I mentioned previously when we were going over the cybercrime landscape, it's very organized and there's very specific verticals, if you will, that cybercrime organizations are focusing on. So one of those verticals is ransomware, obviously, because the trend has been that more and more companies are falling victim to ransomware each year. The amount of attacks that we're seeing is increasing, and that's partly because access to be able to create those attacks or carry out those attacks is greater due to this ransomware as a service model. So essentially, instead of attacking one company, you can attack many by becoming almost like a managed service provider, if you will, of a ransomware distribution group. So that's what the illustration is on the right. So it's impressive to see the amount of variations and the level of innovation, I guess, if you will, amongst some of these attackers to make a buck any way that they can and come up with new business models to do so. On the next slide, we'll transition into credential theft and account takeover. So again, using the 2020 stat, roughly 91% of phishing attacks resulted in stolen credentials. So you saw in the video, these attacks aren't necessarily always carried out independently of one another. In some cases, phishing is a means to delivering ransomware, or phishing is a means to delivering something like a keystroke logger or something that will collect information and credentials. In some cases, the ransomware provides a backdoor to be able to sniff network traffic and collect credentials. So they are used simultaneously in an integrated way to basically collect as much information as possible to then be bought and sold on the dark web. So on the next slide, we just have some kind of facts about credential theft and account takeover. Obviously, we saw a pretty big uptick in credential theft during work from home, which is a continued mode of operation for many businesses. That's not necessarily that the controls were weaker in one environment or the other. It's more along the lines of more and more transactions were happening over the internet because of the way that customers or companies were doing business. So there was more opportunity for that, given the current mode of operation for many companies. So in terms of stolen and weak passwords, about 81% of breaches leveraged stolen or weak passwords, and then 51% of data breaches involve some sort of credential stealing malware. So again, you see malware as a means of creating an opportunity for credential theft and ultimately account takeover. On the next slide, we just have kind of an overview of how business account takeover, business email compromise, most often the one that we see via Office 365, for example, how that would happen. So a lot of times, a user will be using the same password for a lot of different applications that they use over the internet. Some of that gets leaked to the dark web and put on Pastebin or one of those sites, and then another hacker picks it up and kind of uses those and tries to brute force or do password spraying to see what they can get into with that password and username, and oftentimes are successful as the result of that because of the reuse or the just poor quality of the credential itself. So this is just kind of an example of how that happens. It's not necessarily always a one-to-one relationship, like they're targeting certain accounts. They might just find things and then try them out until they're successful in gaining access. Obviously, Office 365 as a platform is pretty highly targeted because of the amount of companies that have moved their email and communication capabilities to that platform. But this happens all over the internet every day. So on the next slide, we have just kind of, just to dispel a rumor, I guess. The younger generation is not much better at reusing passwords and being more secure on the internet than the ages of 31 and up. In fact, they're slightly worse, but basically it's just human nature to try to make it as convenient and easy as possible to access things online. And part of that is reusing passwords from site to site so that you can remember them more easily, but in effect creating a bigger attack surface for attackers once they do, find out one that's compromised, and then they can go around and try it on every other site. So on the next slide here, we just have a site that's put out by a security researcher named Troy Hunt. Basically, it's a site that you can go to. It's Have I Been Pwned? If you type that into your Google browser, it's a legitimate site. And what it will show you is if you type your email address into the search bar, it will tell you which breaches your email has been compromised in and what other data might have been compromised along with it. Now, this is a data source that's being updated all the time. There are other, obviously, tools to do this in a real-time fashion, so you don't have to keep going to the site and typing in your email address every day. So there are ways to do active monitoring, which I'll get into in a minute. On the next slide, we're just going to kind of move into, the mitigation measures, starting with some of the, security awareness. So next slide after this, mitigation measures. We'll get into, first identifying risk and determining security posture. So this is kind of the what can your business do to prevent or be better at detecting and responding to all of this activity that I just kind of went over. So obviously the first and foremost thing that every business should do is have some idea as to what their security posture is. And the only way you can really do that is by doing, risk assessment, gap analysis, whatever you want to call it, on, your people, your process, your technology, and your different layers of controls, your administrative, physical, and technical controls. Beyond that, a more, technical assessment related to your infrastructure, both external and internal. So that would be obviously internal and external network vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And that scope should be expanded. A lot of companies don't expand it to cloud services. So if you have infrastructure in AWS or Office 365 or Azure, doing configuration reviews of those platforms to make sure that you're taking advantage of all the security settings and configurations within them is especially important in this day and age as more and more companies move to public cloud. The security capabilities of those platforms are excellent, but not by default. So you definitely have to make sure that you're taking advantage of those. And then last but not least, performing a social engineering exercise, whether that be simulated phishing, pretext calling, or physical security breach attempts, which is a little less these days because there are not as many people going to offices and to corporate locations. But understanding how your people will respond to a phishing attack or a pretext calling attack is really important in developing that layer of your defense in depth strategy. Because as you saw from the phishing examples, 90% of breaches having some component of social engineering. Obviously, attackers are attacking the human component of security first and foremost. So on the next slide here, we'll just go through a couple others. So piggybacking on that last piece, the security awareness training. At GraVoc, we went to an approach of less and more often is more. In other words, not sitting down once a year to a 45 to 60 minute, talking head session like this one, I guess, to check the box on our security awareness training. We instead do, mostly monthly campaigns that are, I would say, 15 minutes or less, usually skewing towards the less side of things, just specific to certain topics that we want to cover, but getting in front of our audience, our user base, our employees, more often with a consistent message about awareness, and we've seen great results from that. We joke that we get all these phish alerts and nobody trusts anything coming in from email at GraVoc, but that just shows that what we're putting out is effective, and even if it is legitimate, it's good to kind of double check that before you go ahead and respond or react to that email message in any way. And that's kind of the quick, convenient way of reporting potential threats. So on screen, we use a platform called KnowBefore for our security awareness training. It comes with the ability to have a phish alert button right in Outlook so our employees can report suspected phishing emails to our security team, and then we can do our research from there to see if they're legitimate threats and respond to those in kind. On the next slide, talk a little bit more about kind of real-time risk identification. So, there's different settings you can have to, and third-party plugins that you can use. This one is one from a company called Egress. But, there's the first and foremost, built right into Office 365 or Exchange. You can basically tell your employees every time there's an external email. There's so much spoofing that looks like it's coming from an internal domain that isn't. A really easy way to kind of defend against that is to say, every time something comes from outside our organization, it's just going to be a big banner that says external email, use caution. You can see ours is highlighted in red on screen here. So it's just another way to help employees and promote that security awareness throughout the organization. So we'll get into some more kind of technical measures now. On the next slide here, we'll talk a little bit about authentication. So credential managers or password vaults are really useful in this day and age. There are some companies that are trying to go to passwordless authentication, eliminating the password altogether, which I think most employees would appreciate. But for the companies that aren't quite there yet, what they've done is provided a credential vault, credential manager. So here at GraVoc and with our managed service clients, we use LastPass. This screenshot is from IT Glue, which is our knowledge base for our customer credentials for anywhere where we're doing managed services. So it's just a way to store credentials in a secure fashion. There's random password generator features, automatic password rotation in some instances, and then you can tack onto that with multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. MFA is a big focus right now for a lot of our clients in terms of, adding a second factor and not just relying on that single factor of username and password. But yeah, it's another way, another layer to, again, help employees be more secure and make their jobs a little easier in terms of managing all the different credentials that they're provided to carry out their work. On the next slide here, we have, again, some more technical measures. The next few are about security architecture. So, we mentioned that, all those variants of malware produced per day. And so, no antivirus product, whether it be next gen or regular signature-based antivirus, is going to protect, 100% against everything. But what a next-gen antivirus product will do is protect against what's called fileless malware or script-based attacks. It will also detect persistence and be able to give you the ability to isolate infected devices quickly and effectively. Those are features that kind of go above and beyond what your signature-based antivirus is doing now. Carbon Black had another study a year or two ago about the nature of malware in the wild, and basically it concluded that only 49% of malware being used is actually signature-based. The rest of it, 51%, is script-based. So if you look at it in context, the traditional signature-based antivirus is only 49% effective against malware in general because they have no protections against scripts that are being run. That number might even be larger today, and it might even be more of a control gap than it was when that study came out. On the next slide, we'll just see some screenshots of, this is one next-gen antivirus in particular, Carbon Black, and kind of the ability that it gives you in terms of drilling down into insight. Same with the next slide here. We'll see kind of the triage. So it will show you kind of what happens at each component of, a potential malicious script. You can link that into kind of virus total and see if it's a known bad entity. You can take the binary and run it through Malware Sandbox and see what will happen, in a safe manner. So that you don't have to do that in a test or even a production environment. You can do it in a sandbox mode. So there's a lot of capabilities that you get with a next-gen antivirus that are just superior to what the protections being offered by a signature-based AV are. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about sandboxing, but more in the context of email. So, and this is particular to a product called Mimecast, but this is also functionality built right into certain subscriptions of Office 365, where you can do what's called URL detonation, or basically give the ability for you know, a person to make a mistake on clicking on something, but it's still being blocked because it's actually opening and executing whatever the link is doing in a sandbox mode and kind of analyzing it before it actually allows the transaction to happen on the machine itself. So it is kind of a safety net, as we're referring to in the slide here, in the sense that, you know, while you want all your employees not to be clicking on anything malicious, if they do slip up, there are kind of layers you can put in place behind them to catch, you know, some of those mistakes. On the next slide, we'll talk about browser isolation, which is very similar in terms of it actually gives you kind of more of a sandbox in your at the browser level, and when you're, you know, because a lot of malware is delivered through you know, malicious ads and adware and things like that, you know, it will protect against anything that's being clicked on in the browser that could be malicious. It's certainly not a silver bullet, but again, it's another layer of control because a lot of malware is being delivered either through browsers or through obviously malicious attachments and links in email. So those are two controls that kind of mitigate the likelihood and in some cases the impact that you know, there'll be a successful attack through those mediums. On the next slide here, we talk a little bit about kind of free and easy stuff that you can do. Well, I guess some people who are IT admins or sysadmins watching this might scoff at the easy part because it does obviously take some time to implement and, you know, make sure that nothing breaks in the process. But network segmentation, in other words, creating VLANs or, you know, certain areas of the network that can't access other areas of the network, is a great way to mitigate the effects of any malware or you know, direct traversal of the network, like lateral movement, if you will. If a hacker does get onto your network, what they can do, what they can see, what they can execute can all be pretty well locked down through some basic network segmentation and layering, making your network less flat. On the group policy side, I mean, obviously group policy through Active Directory is something that's available to anybody who uses Active Directory, which is, you know, most businesses. There are a lot of things you can do through hardening group policy that help towards mitigating different threats related to malware and ransomware. You know, disabling protocols and macros and, you know, using constrained language mode in PowerShell. Those are all things that are available kind of right out of the box that if you have them configured appropriately, can go a long way to, if not preventing an attack, significantly reducing the impact that that attack has on your infrastructure and the data residing on it. Next slide here is just some examples, screenshots of, you know, where you would go to kind of create those settings and group policy objects. And I think the next slide brings us to potentially question and answer. So I'm going to pause there and see if anything came in while I was rambling on. All right, so up on screen, we have, what is your pricing for your services? I'm a very small business, 3 people, 4 computers. Yeah, so that's probably one we can take offline so I can learn more about kind of what you guys are looking to do, and certainly we can help. We help companies of all sizes, so I'm sure we can, you know, work within your budget to provide whatever you might be looking for. We obviously, as you saw on the slide, we offer a whole bunch of different services. Sometimes we're on service retainers to carry out an information security governance program throughout the year so that it's not just a one and done exercise. So we can talk about kind of all those options to see how we can best protect your particular organization. I don't see any other questions rolling in. So I think we can move to kind of some of the closing remarks. Obviously, I'd be happy to take questions offline when they do come in. But we can certainly move to some of the closing remarks. So in closing, information security is people, process, and technology, not firewalls, encryption, and antivirus. What I mean by that is you don't just go out and buy the best technology, implement it in a half-baked way, and expect to be a secure organization. It really does take a team approach. It takes an army, if you will, of an approach that looks at all of your different levels of your organization. So obviously, I put people first because I think that is the first line of defense. So that's why we spend a lot of time on security awareness and security awareness training, why we spent so much time on security awareness in this particular presentation. Process is also important, and obviously there are technical controls that you can put in place to better your defenses and your capabilities in the security space. But the idea is that technology isn't the end-all be-all answer to the information security governance approach. On the next slide here, we'll just do some kind of 3 things that every organization should be doing. Again, at the top of the list is training and education. That security awareness component is going to take you a long way. Investing in all 3 core components of security posture: protection, detection, and response. Again, that's that defense in depth strategy that we've talked about throughout. So still to this day, most companies spend roughly 80% of their security budgets on preventative measures on the protection side, and then the rest is detection and response. You gotta, obviously, to be good at all 3 phases, you gotta kind of balance that out a little bit, and that's what we work with companies to do. I mean, obviously, every company is working with a different budget, so we have to be smart about kind of what layers are put in place and what layers are going to be most effective for that particular client and the risks and threats that they face in particular. The last piece is testing, retesting, and not being afraid to fail. Obviously, if you put a control in place and then don't test to see if that it works, the control could be not configured appropriately, or all sorts of things could go wrong. So testing is hugely important, and then retesting in terms of making testing a regular part of what you're doing, because the controls change. Obviously, the risk climate and the threats facing our organizations change, and so we need to be able to kind of test on a consistent basis, and not being afraid to identify problems that you can then resolve. Because if you don't identify them out front, there's a good chance that a malicious actor and an attacker is going to identify and exploit those. So it is important to have kind of a consistent testing program to coincide with the other 2 items that we have listed here. And that about wraps up what I had prepared for today. I do thank you for joining me and joining us this afternoon. Obviously, my email is up on screen here, so feel free to reach out to me directly or through our website, or through anybody else you may be in contact with at GraVoc to if you're interested in learning more about how we can help, or if you have a particular question or a problem that you've encountered, we'd be happy to help. Once again, I appreciate you joining us, and I guess we'll be signing off for now. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.